Okay, let's get started. Hello, hi, my name is Dr. Lu Tan from Department of Communication and Journalism. Well, it gives me great pleasure to have Dr. Jessy Li here as our honored speaker. So I'm going to introduce her to you, and then she will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Dr. Jessy Li is an associate professor in the linguistics department at the University of Texas at Austin, where she works on computational linguistics and natural language processing. Her work focuses on discourse processing, text generation, and language pragmatics in social context. She received her PhD in computer and information science from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a recipient of the NSF Career Award, an ACL Outstanding Paper Award, an ACM SIGSOFT Distinguished Paper Award, an Area Chair Favorite Honor at Colin 2018, and a Best Paper nomination at SIGDIAL. Jessy is the current secretary of the North American chapter of ACL.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Can people, Okay. All right, so today I am going to talk about discourse processing. So it's an area that's very close to my heart. And more recent approaches that I've been pushing with my lab on how do we model discourse in more flexible manners as questions and answers. So you don't have to read everything on the left. So we're gonna walk through that text later, in fact. But if we direct our attention here and think about what makes a text coherent and why does that make sense? And this is because a text is coherent if each newly introduced proposition is rhetorically connected to another piece of information and all the anaphoric expressions can be resolved. So this is kind of a classic definition in discourse literature about coherence. In computational linguistics and in NLP, maybe I should do something. Oh, there, okay. So in computational linguistics and NLP, people typically have looked into very structured theories. You may or may not have heard of it. Either way, it's fine. So we have rhetorical structure theory and segmented discourse representation theory. I'll briefly discuss RST in a minute just to lay the ground for this talk. So here is what is called an RST tree, and what it intends to model is the relationship between sentences and clauses in the text. So for the text on the left, again, you don't have to read. The high-level idea is what's on the right, where you have different sentences and each sentence is connected to another with this kind of relationship. So what this is saying is sentence 2 to 6 is a summary. Sentence 1 is the summary of sentences 2 to 6. For example, here, kind of sentences 3 to 4 is an elaboration of sentence 2. So this kind of structure is what has been really fascinating to kind of a large area in NLP to think about, okay, if we can figure this out, then we know what is the intention of the writer when they're writing this text, and we can really connect pieces of information in larger scale. And it is true that across the years, there has been a lot of work that shows discourse being very useful. For example, in sentiment analysis, if you think about this sentence, right? So while always complaining that he hates this type of movies, John bitterly confessed that he enjoyed this movie. So now, even though there is a lot of negative sentiment, the last bit of enjoy, that is the only positive word in this sentence, it is still conveying the positive sentiment in general, and this is because that the RST structure can tell you which part of the information is important within a sentence, and that becomes he enjoyed this movie. So you will be able to do a lot better in sentiment analysis if you know the structure. Work has also shown that this kind of discourse is useful in summarization. So this is work actually from a prior student at UT who did an internship with Microsoft. And this is his work showing that you can represent document in terms of a graph, both in terms of entity linking, as well as kind of the rhetorical structure on the right. And if you do that, then you can do a lot better in summarization. And here is just a brief summary of like why this course is useful. Like historically, there is text classification tasks, machine translation, and its evaluation. There's question answering and dialogue, as well as misinformation and fake news detection. So really, there's a rich history here. But I want to add something. But there's catch. So it's not very common nowadays in the year 2024 to see that this course is kind of the main player in the game. So why is that? So one reason, which is from our prior work from 2020, is showing that discourse relation classification is actually very, very hard. If you do not have signal words like but or however or in contrast, you'll have to have inference on kind of the implicit meaning of text, and that makes progress really difficult. We made a progress of 8 percentage points in 10 years. Second, there is a inherent flaw in how we evaluate these kind of systems. And there is a famous 2017 paper that says, okay, the progress we have made actually is due to a shift in the report of evaluation metrics rather than an actual contribution in the parser or improvement in the parser. And I think in its very roots, the problem of why we make so little progress in discourse processing and discourse parsing is because annotation is extremely difficult to scale. So this is the taxonomy of the RST structure that you just saw. And we have all these like very fine-grained relationships. And not only that, you need to annotate between each sentence these kind of relationships. We also have to have a full document level inference for each elementary discourse unit, which are roughly clauses. So you can imagine how difficult this is even for linguists to do this. Okay, so this is the type of structure you see, and the largest data set in RST is 380 documents annotated by linguists. And then we have the field as a whole in NLP has made progress. The large language models are here. And we see that, well, the generated text is already coherent, or this is quoting a professor of rhetoric writing in UT Austin. They are at the level of an average college student essay. Second, we see that the state-of-the-art performance in many NLP tasks, including question answering, summarization, dialogue generation, they're all already kind of achieved state-of-the-art without using explicit tools in discourse. So here comes a reckoning that kind of gradually happening with my group. How can we actually harness the generative ability of large language models to actually model discourse? And second, can we do some other contributions the other way around? Can we use or find a discourse model that's new and to say that it is useful for a wider range of tasks that are different from the tasks that people were interested in? I think we have found the answer, and the answer is a different framework in discourse called questions under discussion. So this is a talk about that. So in this talk, I will just touch on 3 parts. The first is I'm going to tell you what is questions under discussion. And we have some data sets to kind of hone that to home. Second, we have developed parsers and evaluation metrics for deriving this kind of QUD structures. And third, I will talk about 2 more recent work on how do we actually use QUDs in downstream applications. Okay, so first, what is QUD? As it turns out, discourse as questions and answers has a long history. This is not the first work, but this is kind of a work from 2020 from Valentina Piatkin. And what it says is you can recover discourse relations or annotate discourse relations by defining a set of very set question templates. In essence, for example, if kind of the discourse relation is causality, then you would be, in theory, be able to use kind of a question like why. So that's kind of intuitive. But what we are trying to push here is something a lot more generalizable. So let's take a step back and actually read the text that I showed you earlier, okay? But we're not gonna read it from top to bottom, we're gonna read it like this, okay? So first of all, this first sentence, California legislators searching for ways to pay for damages from last week's earthquake are laying the groundwork for a temporary increase in the state's sales tax. Now, as you, a curious reader, stop here, you may actually wonder, wait, what is prompting the California legislators to seek alternative forms of relief? Okay, so this is something that you kind of organically generates in your head, and you can see if you read on, the talk of a sales tax rise follows a rebuff from Congress on the question of how much the federal government is willing to spend to aid the California's earthquake relief efforts. You see that, oh wait, this sentence actually answered my question. Okay. Now, at this point, you may ask another question. That is, what would be the advantage of this proposed sales tax? And now you actually see in sentence number 5, it gets answered again. Sales tax increase appears to be the fastest and the easiest to raise funds in a hurry. So you can see now when you ask this question, it answers not in the next sentence, but later in the text. So put it formally, question and discussion views each sentence in the discourse as addressing a very often implicit question, either by answering it or bringing up another question that can help the previous question. And the linguistic form of that sentence, in turn, depend on the QUD that it actually addresses. So this is actually a very, very old framework. It has worked from decades in linguistics research. And a full QUD tree looks something like this. This is a small data set annotated originally in German, I think, to like kind of look like a hierarchical structure. So there is kind of prior efforts trying to build these kind of giant hierarchical structures. Most notably from the Kuthis group in Germany, who did 2 sections of interview. There is also from Edinburgh, from Westera et al, kind of TED Talks. So the goal of our research is to actually create more resources for models to be able to produce these kind of questions and produce these kind of structures. And along the way, we need to define the relevant tasks as well as defining evaluation metrics. So I guess the first thing we need to discuss is what kind of questions are QUDs? And here I want to contrast kind of the QUD questions with the factoid questions that people are used to in the field. So in question answering in NLP very traditionally, we look at a Wikipedia text and we have some facts and we ask questions about that fact. For example, when was Latin version of the first of the word Norman first recorded? And you can see these are kind of the type of questions that we are very used to in document comprehension. They are very, very factoid. On the other hand, if we think about QUD, it's a very different type of questions. So let's say here is a sentence that you see, this gritty city of 7.6 million rarely gets respect. It often ranks low in livability surveys and near the top of the hemisphere's ugliest capitals. Now, if you are a reader and you read this, these like factoid questions are not the ones you want answered. Instead, you may think about, oh, there are interesting facts that are described here and I want to know more, right? So first of all, why is this city called gritty in the first place? Second, why does it rarely get respect? Third, what constitutes livability in those surveys? And fourth, what are some other ugly capitals? Right, so as you can see, these kind of high-level questions or information-seeking questions or inquisitive questions, whatever you want to call them, is very, very different from the type of factoid QA that you have. So the very first work we did in this, in kind of getting into QUD, is actually from 4 years ago. It's not showing the. Anyway, so we introduced a data set called Inquisitive. That is, we crowdsourced this kind of very macro inquisitive questions from readers reading through a document without seeing the answer. And we collected about 20,000 questions in that vein. It looks something like this. We have a context, we have the current sentence, we have the readers select which part of the sentence they want to ask questions about, and then we ask them to ask questions. All of the questions here are validated by independent judges to see, okay, whether this question is valid in itself, whether it's related to the span that the user highlighted, and third, what is kind of, the question is not already answered in prior context. So we have a bunch of questions observed in this kind of way of eliciting. So first of all, there are lots of causal questions, so why questions. We also have elaboration questions. Mostly these are how questions. We have background questions asking about kind of the background story of an event. We have definition questions asking about knowledge. And we also have instantiation questions, so asking about specific instances or examples of an event or people that were discussed in the event. So at the time we fine-tuned GPT-2, we used the same validation process that the humans went through. And we found that GPT-2 can already generate pretty nice questions given our data set. With 76% being valid and 89% kind of very highlighted, very related to the span, and only 10% that are already answered in previous context. So even at the time with our data set, you can do pretty well on this type of question generation. But here is a catch, yet another catch. The thing is, we can generate all these questions. You can ask anything you want, but we don't know if these questions are answered in the first place. Right, so an idea that we had at the time was, okay, we had this data set that had so many questions. Why don't we just find sentences that has the answers, if any, and we can train a question answering model with that, and we can have sentence level connections. It turns out the story is not that easy. We had ourselves and linguistic students annotating where the answers are. It turns out to be extremely difficult for some reason. And this is because there is a very high cognitive load. You almost have to read the entire article. Sometimes they can be really, really long for the reader to actually remember what was said before and understand what is an answer. And I think the more challenging part is kind of what defines an answer is actually pretty subjective, in a sense that some people may think, oh, this is not an answer at all. The other people were thinking, oh, well, this partially answers the question. So it's kind of this level of difficulty was not something that we were expecting. So what we pivoted in the end is to think about a new way of defining questions and answers. And that is how we introduced the DCQA data set. It's called Discourse Comprehension by Question Answering. So the idea here is instead of asking questions freely without seeing the answer, we draw from QUD recovery. That is, viewing each sentence as an answer to an implicit question that came from prior context. So here, the task becomes, now we have the answer. We need to annotate the question. And we also need to find where the question could come from. So we found that in the end, this is a new annotation scheme that we can use to contribute to both answering these QUDs and also perform QUD parsing for the entire document. So let me explain how this works. Okay, so it's the same article we have seen earlier, the California legislator one with the earthquake. So we have first sentence and the second sentence we have read. So the first part, the first task is, if we look at sentence number 2, we need to perform question generation, meaning how does the second sentence elaborate on the previous context? So what we can say is that second sentence is an answer to a question that looks like this. What is prompting the California legislators to seek alternative forms of relief? And we can say that now this sentence 2 answer the question in yellow, and we need to ground the question in that yellow in some prior context. Here, the prior context is only sentence number 1, so we can say that kind of this sentence, this question is grounded in sentence number 1. We do this for every single sentence in the document. So for example, sentence number 3 is an answer to the question, what type of relief is being considered? So now we can also say that sentence number 1 can be, this question can be elicited from sentence number 1, which we call anchor. Sentence number 4 is an answer to what would the shortfall be, and that is also anchored, that is anchored in sentence number 3. And finally, sentence number 5 is an answer to the question, what would be the advantage of the proposed tax? And we already saw earlier that that came from sentence number 2. Okay, so in summary, we have question generation phase, looking at the answers and kind of thinking about what questions it actually answered. And then we do question linking to the previous contexts. So now if we want to perform question answering, it becomes easier. So instead of attaching each question to the answer, we now attach each question to the anchor and say that the answer is kind of the answer sentences that the question came from. So this kind of link is now performing for the question answering task. If we think about QUD in this way, we could actually collect a data set. We asked annotators to ask about the focus of the answer sentence, to ask open-ended questions, not to use information that only got introduced in the new sentence, and make sure that the question answer pairs are compatible. And we did that for 607 articles across 3 news outlets. And this yielded about 22,000 questions in total. The thing that I want to highlight is we did this in a fairly short amount of time. And we did this purely only using Mechanical Turk workers. So kind of there were some quality assurance that we built in our annotation pipeline, but the fact that we were able to collect this with crowdsourcing and in a short amount of time showed that this is actually a very viable, scalable framework in contrast to RST that you need teams of linguists to do it. So let's look at some of the nature of the data. So the first question we asked is, okay, so is this a data set where you can trivially find question answer connections with neighboring sentences? Basically, are the questions trivially anchored in a sentence that immediately precede the answer? The answer is not really. So this is our data set. This is the percentage of sentences that are 1 sentence away or neighboring sentences, 2 to 4 sentences away or greater than 5 sentences away. We can see that we do have a high percentage of greater than 5 sentences. This is another data set from Edinburgh. You can see that it has no sentence greater than 5 sentences away. But what you can also see is, we actually annotated the answers for the inquisitive data set. And we see that for inquisitive, the question answer distance is actually pretty long, even compared to our data set. So there's still a gap, but we think this is kind of a progress already. We also check, do annotators actually ask the same questions given the same answer sentence? So we annotated with humans question similarity, and we can see that in general, the answer is no. These are pretty subjective questions. However, the next thing we did is to say, okay, if we also constrain the anchor to be the same, then what you see is this very, so 5 means identical questions. So you see that 70% of the time, we have kind of, if you have the same answer and the same anchor, you have identical questions. So similar questions are more likely to be grounded in the same anchor. So now we also ask, well, can humans actually answer these questions, right? So we collected the question by first assuming that the answer is the answer to the question, but then can we ask humans to do the other way around and say, okay, if we go from the questions, can we find those answers that were deemed as answers originally? We had one expert annotator, who is a linguistic undergraduate in our group. So she went out to find answers. She found kind of 72% of the time she was able to recover the exact sentence that the questions came from. And even when she failed, this is due to multiple valid answers rather than not being an answer. So here is an example, probably don't need to go into it for multiple valid answers. Okay, so for the question answering task, actually, I think I should skip this for time. So we did train a model to do the question answer task, and we show that it works pretty well. Okay, so in this first part, I talked about what is QUD. Existing QUD data sets is pretty rare. So what we did is to provide resources and scaffolding to promote kind of this way of modeling discourse through high-level reasoning across the text. We provided the inquisitive data set as a new data set of kind of forward-looking questions without seeing the answers, and DCQA as a paradigm of question and answer pairs in the document. All right, so with the DCQA data set, what we were able to do is to actually build parsers and evaluate the structures. So let's go into that. Here is the same piece of text. We already know that sentence 2 and sentence 5 form a question answering relationship. If you think about this as an edge, and the question from sentence number 2 is answered in sentence number 5, then what you can see is that the entire document can be viewed this way, where you have questions and answers connecting each sentence, and the label of these dependency edges are going to be the actual questions. So one question we asked very early on is how do we actually think about this type of framework versus something like RST? Do they actually carry the same amount of information? If so, why do we even need this structure? So first of all, from kind of a theory point of view, the RST has this notion called clarity, meaning that sentence number 1, if it's the summary of all of these other sentences, then it's more important. I want to say that in QUD, this is not the case. Here, the head of a dependency only means that it is the anchor of a question. There is not the same notion of salience as in RST. Second, we looked at the tree structure. We see that RST trees are slightly deeper. QUD trees are slightly deeper than RST. We have a height of 6.7 compared to 5.8. Also, QUD trees have more long-range dependencies across kind of different parts of the article. We also looked into how do we compare these kind of questions with the type of rhetorical or discourse relations that I said earlier. So we again asked students in linguistics to annotate pairs of question answers in the data set we collected. And we found that the first thing is questions can actually provide finer grained information. So let's say if you have these two sentences and their RST label is elaboration, what QUD can do is actually describe how the second sentence elaborates the first one. So this is intuitive. What we found very interesting is the fact that presenting the QUD can actually improve annotation in RST. So even though they're a linguistic student, you can see that the original agreement is pretty low. So this is the nature of how difficult it is to annotate RST even among linguistic students. But if they see the question, now suddenly they have a much higher annotator agreement. Third one, I want to emphasize that the questions and the discourse relations are not a one-to-one relationship. So here, this is the same questions that the annotators ask. However, if you annotate for RST, all of these relations would hold. Now from these kind of analysis, what we see is, well, okay, RST and kind of these kind of question answers actually do seem to be complementary structures that are very different from each other. So what we can do is to actually build a parser. From the DCQA dataset we have collected, we could train a model to actually give us this kind of structure. So we divide this into two tasks. The first task is a question generation. The second task is to find where the anchor is. Okay, so here the input is going to be document and the answer sentence. And the answer sentence, we use the answer sentence to generate the question and then try to find where in previous context that the question can come from. So we used a pipeline model to do this. So first of all, we tried a non-formal model for anchor selection. So given the answer sentence, where can we find the most relevant anchor? And the second model is the question generation model, where we take the anchor and take the context and the answer, try to generate the question. So the eventual model looks something like this, where we have the document, we first generate the anchor, and now we have the anchor, we generate the question. The pipeline looks something like this. We have an input document. Let's say the third sentence is what we are interested in. It is the answer sentence. We first use the non-formal model to generate the anchor. And given the anchor, we give that to a GPT-2 model to fine-tune it for the question generation. In the end, we actually trained another model. It's called a re-ranker model to not only sample multiple times from the GPT-2 model, but also re-rank them according to the plausibility of these questions. So we have also done quite a bit of kind of large language model experiments with this type of framework using few-shot prompting. So the first step is doing question generation. Notice that this is the opposite of the previous pipeline where we first found the anchor. So here we found it's much more effective to first generate the question, and then we perform answer selection. So you don't need to read here, it's just the prompt. Okay, so now we have ways to derive these kind of structures, and we need to ask ourselves, how do we actually evaluate that? So this is actually a pretty intense challenge, because in the past, when we annotate kind of discourse structures, it's all taxonomy based. We know that the space of the classification label is finite, but here all we have is questions. It's kind of it's a generation problem rather than a classification problem all of a sudden. And we say that kind of the other problem is if we look at metrics for question generation, they actually don't satisfy the things and criteria or this errata that we have for QUD. So first of all, they check whether the questions and answers are compatible. They check whether the question is related to the article. They check whether the question is similar to some existing human annotated questions. But these actually don't quite capture what QUDs are because of the linguistic constraints that QUDs come from. Okay, so let me illustrate our framework for how do we think about QUD eval. Okay, so here is another article. So kind of the first sentence says the US exports of nuclear material cannot be adequately traced from country to country according to a congressional report. And second sentence is scarcely a day goes by without a report of a new black market deal. This Senator John Glenn reacted to the report. So let's say that here we have a question-answer relationship between the first and second sentence. And the question is, what do lawmakers think about this issue? We say that this has a good language quality. It looks like a question. It's grammatical. It's related. The questions and answers are actually compatible. So here, if you ask this question, when you read sentence number 1, you see that sentence number 2 is actually an answer to this question. The third notion is kind of we need for readers to be able to come up with this question when only exposed to sentence number 1 rather than sentence number 2. So this is very important because this is kind of defined as kind of the common ground between the reader and the article. So it's important to make sure that there are no new concepts introduced in the question itself. So here there are no new concepts introduced. We also see that while it is quite possible and plausible that this sentence or this question is grounded in sentence number 1. So that's all good. We have another question that's all good, but let's look at a not so great case. So this is between sentence 1 and 5. So sentence 5 is the report says hundreds of tons of plutonium and highly enriched uranium have accumulated worldwide. And the question generated from the machine is, what does the report say is the reason for the export ban? So now if you think about this question, well, it still looks like a question. It's grammatical and related and whatnot. But if you think about, you know, is sentence number 5 actually answering this question? You can say that if you ask this question from sentence number 1, the sentence number 5 is actually not answering it, right? So it's not a compatible question. And the third thing is, well, there is nothing about sentence number 1 that would give you the idea that there is an export ban, or at least, you know, right at the beginning. You may have a vivid imagination, but, you know, it's kind of a far stretch anyway. So we can say that there is hallucination in this question. And furthermore, even though the question mentioned the word report, there is a lot about kind of reason and then export ban that's not related to the first sentence, so it's only somewhat grounded in the first sentence. So here is another kind of mistake. So now sentence number 6 is about the report does not include figures on US nuclear exports, but includes something else. So here, the question and answer is actually compatible. However, there is still hallucination in this question because when you first read, hey, there's a report, it's a very far stretch to say, oh, what's not included in the report. You would much rather say what is in the report, right? So that's still hallucination, and we say that this sentence is, this question is only somewhat grounded in the first sentence. The criteria that we have identified correspond to these 4 categories I showed earlier. The first one is linguistic quality. The second one is answer compatibility. Here we have 3 levels. So it's a direct and explicit answer, or it's an unfocused answer. Unfocused answer means the answer is kind of partially related, or the answer is kind of a very non-important part of the sentence, which makes this kind of question not a QUD. the question and the answer is not compatible. We have givenness, so this is the fact that we should not have new concepts in the question. So it can be either no new concepts, which is great, or it could be answer leakage, meaning that the question leaks concepts in the answer, or it could be hallucination, meaning that there is some random concepts introduced by the model. And the fourth criteria is the relevance of the anchor that we found. So we introduced a data set generating QED structures from a range of models. So these include our own fine-tuned model with the long-former and GPT-2. We use GPT 3.5, Alpaca, and GPT-4. And each of these questions and answer pairs are annotated by 3 trained linguists. So let's first take a look at the results for all these models on answer compatibility. So we see that so our fine-tuned model, which was done before this work, did not so great on this task, where we often generated questions that are not the answer to the question in the first place. It turns out Alpaca is not doing so well. But when we switched to GPT 3.5, we generated a lot of compatible questions and answers, and GPT-4 is the same. Okay, so this looks interesting. So with large language models, the larger the scale, the better it seems compatible the questions and answers are. However, if we look at givenness, it's a different picture. So here, our own fine-tuned model rarely introduces new concepts in the questions. For Alpaca, we see answer leakage a lot. But even for models like GPT 3.5, we also see a lot of answer leakage as well as hallucination. And when we switch to GPT-4, this is the same result, where we see a lot of answer leakage, but less hallucination. And I want to note that we explicitly asked these models to not introduce new concepts, did prompt engineering for a long time. The next one is relevance. So is the anchor grounded is the question grounded in the anchor? So we see that our fine-tuned model did pretty well on this, around 70%. There is kind of a 10% that's not grounded, but Alpaca did slightly worse. And here we actually see much worse performance with the GPT 3.5 model, where a lot of the anchors identified are incorrect. And finally, with GPT-4, it's doing about as good as Alpaca, but actually not as good as our fine-tuned model. So yeah, I can skip this. What we also tried is to actually using kind of the data we annotated to benchmark a lot of the evaluation metrics for scoring questions and answers. So we tried everything from rule-based to GPT scoring to kind of classical information status classifiers. And what you can see is these numbers are really low. That means the correlation between model evaluation of the questions does not correspond at all to human evaluation. So we still have a long way to go. Okay, so to summarize this part, we presented the first QED dependency parsers, either trained or fine-tuned or using LLMs. We can see that large language models actually do not do a really good job at QED parsing. We also provide guidelines for human evaluation of these parsers. And by benchmarking existing metrics, we see that they don't quite work yet. So there is a lot of challenge here to actually produce the valid structure. And finally, we already see, I think earlier, that RST and QED are complementary frameworks. All right, so I think time to move to the last part of the talk, where we attempted to use the QUD model in downstream tasks. And I'm going to talk about two applications, both of them in simplification. I will mention other tasks in passing at the end. So what is simplification? It is an automatic process that takes a text that is difficult for a particular audience to understand and simplify that to the reading level of your intended audience. So here we're trying to simplify this text on the left to something that is understandable by kids. Okay, so the text on the left says, results could help the team better understand ancient Egyptian health and correspondingly modern day health. For instance, some mummies still have arteries in their mummified remains, and sometimes scientists can tell if those arteries are hardened. Okay, so here, this is a professional simplification where the editor kind of said this and then said an artery is a tube that moves blood through the body, and then said the artery could show if the person had been healthy or not. What you can see here is there is actually a lot of added content on the right. So on the left, there is no definition of what is an artery. On the left, it is also not explicit to say that the status of the artery could show if the person had been healthy. So how do we ask modern models to generate something on the right without hallucinating too much and being so out of touch to the original text as it generates definitions? So our argument is that you could view these added content on the right as answers to implicit QUDs. So for example, if you say here, hey, here I have an implicit QUD that is what is an artery, then the natural response of your next sentence should be the definition of an artery, right? Similarly, if you say, okay, now I have this natural definition of the artery, we say, okay, now you have another QUD that says what can the arteries tell us, then the next sentence is a natural answer to that question. So the idea here is we could recover these kind of implicit QUDs in order to guide a text simplification system to be better able to generate content addition like this. We did data collection, that was work in 2021. So what we did is to take the context, we tried to generate QUDs using different types of framework in inquisitive and DCQA. And then using these questions, we guide a GPT model to generate these questions, generate the elaborations. And then in evaluation, we asked, okay, which elaboration would you pick? And I guess the key takeaway here is that the QUD-based approach vastly outperforms the non-QUD-based approach, even approaching kind of how often human elaborations are generated. So the second application is from our recent work simplifying medical documents. So here on the left, we have documents reporting randomized clinical control trials. On the right, we have kind of a plain language summary of that document. And what I want to point out is that simplification is actually pretty lossy. So for example, here you have non-small cell lung cancer patients, and here the model just outputted lung cancer patients. And you can see how this kind of tiny losses accumulates and become very inaccurate in the simplification. Similarly, here we have other types of procedures, and here there's only like other treatments. Okay? So what we ended up doing is to do this cross-document QUD generation, where we kind of identify the type of problematic information loss between the two articles, so the simplified and the original version. And then we asked annotators or large language models to generate questions and answers in plain language between these two documents. Yeah, what we did make sure is all of these questions follow the same QUD guideline that we introduced in our evaluation earlier, so that this is a very kind of reader-friendly way to expand the elaboration, expand the simplification, where kind of the reader reads the document, it can actually answer, ask the sentence, and it can answer this sentence from the original document. So these are the two relevant work that came from our group recently. I want to point out that people also in the field have been using QUD in various ways. So the first one is text planning in aspect-based summarization, where you kind of have a document and you actually plan your discourse or your answer with questions. And the second one is work from MNLP this year from AI2, where they perform decontextualization. So the idea is if you have kind of if you have a document that tries to make claims for prior work, you can take that out. But if you do that, then it's not going to be connected to other parts of the document. So what they can do is to generate questions using QUD and then to expand the citation context for it to stand alone. Okay, so to summarize, we talked about QUDs today. And we say that it is a free-form kind of discourse relations rather than having a fixed taxonomy. What we did is to kind of provide scaffolding for people to be able to build models and evaluate models with it. And we can see that it's very naturally connected to question answering and question generation tasks in NLP, and it can integrate pretty well with a fairly broad range of tasks. And with that, I want to thank my students and the key collaborator here, Greg. And that's it. Thank you.